in which infantryman R.L. Crimp eats bully beef and sweet potatoes in a forward camp in the North African desert. In September 1941, R.L. Crimp found himself in an austere and primitive forward camp in the North African desert, a couple of 100 miles behind the front line. Life was led entirely in the open air, under the broiling sun by day, and by night in blanket beds on the hard desert surface under the stars. Crimp had been assigned to a motorized infantry unit of 30 trucks. His section's truck, called Mabel after the driver's wife, was surrounded by their gear and supplies: a Bren gun, a boy's anti-tank rifle, several boxes of ammunition, a large Italian medical chest in which they stored their rations, about half a dozen 2-gallon water cans, and another half a dozen supposedly untouchable cans to be kept for an emergency. At 6 o'clock each evening, one man from each of the sections was called to collect their rations. Equipped with sacks, canisters, and empty water cans, they made their way over to the quartermaster's sergeant, who had already laid out 4 cans of bully for each 6-man section, a tin of milk, a tin of cheese, and 1 orange per man. The men greeted him with the usual opening gambit: "What, no fresh meat?" In fact, fresh meat only ever appeared once in a blue moon, but the men made it a habit to groan over their bully beef. The chances were that the cans of bully beef had been shipped all the way to North Africa from the Fray Bentos canning factory in Argentina, which supplied Britain with most of its corned beef during the war. "Anyone now for Kraft's specials?" called out the sergeant. This was the hardtack the troops compared to dog biscuits. No doubt the 28-pound tins had been packed in Carr's Carlisle biscuit factory. Last, but certainly not least, the sugar and tea were carefully measured out. Heavily laden, the men made their way back to camp. As darkness fell, Crimp's section prepared themselves a simple dinner of bully beef and tinned potatoes, followed by rice pudding with a dollop of jam and an orange. Then the men began the serious business of brewing tea. The brew can was filled with water and set over a biscuit tin with a few inches of petrol-soaked sand in the bottom. When the water had come to a rolling boil, a couple of handfuls of tea leaves were thrown in, and the brew was set aside to strengthen. Meanwhile, tinned milk and sugar were distributed among the mugs gathered around the fire. "As long as there's no lack of char or fags, everyone's happy," wrote Crimp. "When there's a shortage of either, morale slumps." When war broke out in 1939, the British Isles sat at the centre of a complex trading web. Every day between 15 and 20 ships docked at British ports, bringing the wheat, meat, sugar, tea and canned milk that fed the nation's working classes. In 1939, Britain imported from Canada virtually all the wheat it used to make bread. It also imported large quantities of grain as fodder for livestock, as British farms still produced almost half of the country's meat supplies and all of its milk. However, in wartime it made more sense to grow wheat and import meat. The farmers out on Canada's western prairies adapted by cultivating coarse feed grains instead of wheat. These were fed to pigs on the east coast to make into bacon for Britain. New Zealand responded to Britain's request for cheese. At the same time, the United States provided deboned and telescoped beef so as to fit as much as possible into ships' holds, canned spam and sausages, cheese and dried egg. In order to reach North Africa, Crimp's ship had sailed from England to Durban before continuing up the east coast of Africa and into the Suez Canal. German U-boats had effectively closed the Mediterranean to Allied shipping, and all troops and supplies for the North African campaign were forced to make the long journey around the Cape. This caused chaos in the Red Sea ports, as they did not have the capacity to cope with the more than 5 million tons of imported goods that were needed for the military campaign alone. Matters were made worse by American businessmen, not yet in the war, trying to capitalise on the shortage of consumer goods in the Middle East. Incongruous piles of crates of stockings and underwear imported from the United States began to build up on the docks alongside tanks and military supplies. The Middle East was saved from chaos by the Middle East Supply Centre, which successfully coordinated the food stocks, industrial production, and import needs of the region so that it remained stable despite the wartime disruption. Meanwhile, the military campaign was not going well, and in the summer of 1942, the Allies were driven back across the desert towards Cairo. On their diet of bully beef and biscuit, the troops fell sick with jaundice, dysentery, vitamin deficiency diseases, and battle fatigue. Large consignments of tinned fruit were brought up from South Africa in an effort to supply the men with vitamins, fibre, and the will to fight. Winston Churchill was determined to prioritise the needs of the troops fighting to push the Germans off the African continent, but the demands on British shipping were increasing. The United States was supplying less meat to Britain than it had promised, and the Ministry of Food was lobbying hard for extra ships to be sent to Argentina and Australia to replenish Britain's depleted meat reserves. Churchill therefore decided to safeguard the supply of food imports into Britain and cut the number of ships sailing to the Indian Ocean by 60%. The consequences for the subjects of the empire were severe. In East Africa, forced conscription took many men off the reserves and into the army. Others were recruited as labourers in the ports and railways and as hands on white settlers' farms in the Rhodesias in Kenya. The elderly, women and children left behind on the reserves struggled to plant in time for when the long rains began in February. Added to this, the colonial administrations were pressing for the peasants to sell as much maize as possible to the government. That this left poorer households without food reserves and vulnerable to famine simply did not enter into their calculations. In mid-February 1943, 2 ships scheduled for India were diverted to take grain to East Africa to ease the situation. The Viceroy of India, Lord Linlithgow, protested against these diversions, for a food crisis was brewing in India. But Churchill and his scientific advisor, Lord Cherwell, were unsympathetic. Churchill regarded Eastern colonial governments as improvident and pronounced that there was no reason why all parts of the British Empire should not feel the pinch in the same way as the mother country has done. In 1943, Ian Stevens, editor of the Calcutta newspaper The Statesman, was struck by how quietly famine comes. There was no shouting, no violence, no looting of shops. The starving simply wandered about, bewildered and finding no help, squatted in the byways and grew feebler and lay down and after a while died. It took an 8-week campaign on the part of The Statesman, which ran editorials and published photographs of the dead and dying on the streets of Calcutta, before the British government in London finally acknowledged in October 1943 that Bengal had been struck by famine. And it was only when Lord Wavell replaced the incompetent Linlithgow as Viceroy that any decisive action was taken to remedy the appalling situation. The military now escorted deliveries of rice to rural areas. Price controls were enforced and rationing was introduced. People continued to die, but the starving and the destitute on Calcutta's streets were rounded up to perish out of sight in special camps. While just over 31,000 Allied infantry died in the North Africa campaign, around 3 million Bengalis died from starvation and the effects of malnutrition. Incompetence in India certainly exacerbated the situation, but Churchill and his war cabinet deliberately chose to sacrifice India's population to hunger. The British civilians' wartime ration was heavily dependent on bread and potatoes, both of which were unrationed. To the nutritionist's satisfaction, however, from 1942, the national loaf was wholemeal. In the interwar years, there had still been poor families in Britain for whom meat was a rare treat. Now, rationing guaranteed every working-class person a shilling's worth of meat per week, as well as 4 ounces of bacon, 2 ounces each of cheese and butter, 4 ounces of margarine, 3 pints of milk, an egg or its equivalent in dried egg powder, 8 ounces of sugar, and 2 ounces of tea. In addition, the Subcommittee on Food Policy managed to ensure a programme of free school meals, priority supplies of milk for pregnant women and nursing mothers, as well as milk, orange juice, and cod liver oil for under 5s. Rickets and vitamin deficiency diseases all but disappeared in Britain, and maternal and infant mortality rates improved. The stubborn pocket of working-class deprivation was at last removed. During the war, the hierarchy of priorities that had always operated within the empire became glaringly obvious. British citizens were prioritised. Below them were the white settlers in the dominions, and last and definitely least came Britain's colonial subjects. The Bengalis, who died of famine in their millions, and the East Africans forced to sell their reserves of maize and robbed of food security, were not simply suffering from unrelated wartime shortages. They were the other side of the coin that ensured that the British were well fed and maintained their health and energy throughout the war. The trading rules of the empire had always been rigged in favour of Britain. The war both intensified the exploitation of colonialism and exposed the hollowness of its rhetoric. On the 20th of December 1926, Lord Meath, the organiser of the Empire Day movement, had invited representatives from various colonies to make an Empire Christmas pudding in London. As each ingredient was carried in by turbaned Indian servants, it was formally announced as if it were a guest at a ball, and was then added to an enormous mixing bowl. The ceremony finished with representatives from Canada, Australia, South Africa, British Guiana, Jamaica and India coming together to give the pudding a collective ritual stir. Part of the invented tradition of the Victorian Christmas was Stir Up Sunday, the last Sunday before Advent, when each member of the family gave the mixture a stir while making a wish. The Empire Day pudding ceremony created a powerful visual image of the empire as Britain's family. Shared food habits and tastes create the feeling that we belong to a larger group. To trace the history of the national foods of former British colonies is to create a web of connections that the British Empire wove around the globe. These developments created a system that connected all 5 inhabited continents and shaped the eating habits of the modern world. Although the empire has long since been dismantled, its legacy lives on in how Britain and its former colonies define their national identities.